I hate Terry Lee. I hate that she is a smug bitch who says terrible things behind her back. I hate that she is a bore in the company of those who push past others who are more qualified using flattery and servility rather than skill and determination. I hate that she is more than willing to screw over anyone if it makes her look better. And I hate her because she hates me. And she hates me mostly, I guess, because instead of joining the other office lackeys in their sickening attempts to ingratiate themselves with her, I'm more than willing to call her crap. I don't go out of my way to create a problem, but I have put it in its place a few times. Of course, as a fellow manager, I'm in a better position to fight back than some of the other guys, and that's what I did. We argued about office politics. They disagreed on issues of hiring, firing, and promotions. She accused me of favoring my friends, and I answered her in the same way. And we had completely different management styles. She is a meticulous perfectionist, constantly evaluating and correcting employees, always looking for a problem, even if there is none. She is more than willing to belittle or marginalize anyone who somehow doesn't fall into her little circle of sycophants. I believed in a more relaxed environment and tended to ignore rules that I didn't think mattered. And although I don't particularly like some of the people in the office, I think I make a good faith effort to be fair. Therefore, for a long time there was a kind of cold war between us, endless petty disagreements, malicious remarks, and, at least on her part, behind the scenes fighting at the lower level. But all these were little things before a real war broke out between us. It all started when I received an email, also sent to HR, about a bad joke that Gabriel Prince, one of the statistical experts, told during work hours. It was a crude joke about a woman who became more interested in a man when she learned that he was half an ass. And of course, Gabe, who has a history of telling dirty jokes, foolishly decided to tell it to a large audience during lunch. Naturally, a couple of the more concerned women, Terry's protégés, saw an opportunity to take offense and immediately reported the incident to Terry. Terry immediately demanded, at a minimum, an official reprimand and possibly a transfer to another position. I was sure that he would not be transferred to another position, but knowing that a reprimand would create problems for him during the annual certification, I began to strongly object to this. There were emails, then phone calls, and finally, personal conversations and group meetings, some of which became quite heated. But I thought that reason would prevail in the end, and I was confident that I was in control of the situation. That all changed at the department's monthly performance review meeting, which was attended by all the various managers and some higher-level employees, including Gabriel Prince. We reviewed practices and policies, and as usual, Terry essentially commanded the meeting to endlessly criticize behavior and point out how we were technically violating corporate policy under the strictest interpretation of the rules. Her goal seemed to be to make everything we did subject to company rules, while she would play the role of a kind of Orwellian enforcer. But this was nothing new, and we listened to her chatter in relative boredom until she dropped the bomb. As part of her concern about how loosely we were following the policy, she brought up the joke incident and described it in general terms, and then actually mentioned Gabe's name, at which time several people present cast wary glances at the bright red Gabriel Prince. She continued to say that this jeopardizes the work environment and that everyone's emotional well-being should be valued and respected. She ended her little diatribe with an explosive statement. Such a violation of corporate policy must be taken seriously, and I am raising this issue now so that we can take action as soon as possible. I believe we should hold an emergency meeting of the HR committee and ask for him to be suspended without pay until HR's review is completed, and when the review is completed, consider whatever disciplinary action they propose as the minimum penalty we apply. Her last statement sucked all the air from the room, leaving it dead silent. I was so stunned that I simply replayed her last statement and its implications over and over again in my mind, too stunned to offer any immediate rebuttal. Finally, when it became clear that no one else was going to talk, I cleared my throat and began to speak as carefully as possible. Look, I'm very familiar with the situation, and I think this is an easily fixable problem, and I'm confident that it can be dealt with without a nuclear explosion. I think we can wait for HR to gather all the facts and act once they have some recommendations." She rolled her eyes, shook her head, and with a disgusting, narrowed gaze, spat out her venom. Mr. Prince's actions have crossed all boundaries, and what he said is in fact sexual harassment and creates a very uncomfortable work environment for the other women here. Several of her closest allies grunted in support, nodding to each other like life-size dolls in business suits. I gritted my teeth in response and looked at Gabe with raised eyebrows. Before the meeting, I told him that he needed to publicly apologize, and he took my signal, swallowed hard, and began to speak. "Look, Terry, I'm really sorry, it was just a joke. A bad joke that I recognize as inappropriate." Terry's face immediately darkened. "For you, Mr. Prince, I am Miss Lee." Gabe's face turned even redder, and he stuttered out another apology. Listen. Those... Miss Lee, forgive me for the joke, but I probably thought..." "That's the problem, Mr. Prince. You didn't think so. You simply made an uncomfortable work environment worse. I'm not going to allow the women in this department to be abused like that. I tried to appear neutral, to remain above the bickering and maintain an impartial demeanor, but I had had enough, more than enough, and I charged into the conversation with a little more energy than I had intended." "Violence? Really?" He told a joke, and as far as I know, almost everyone present, both men and women, thought it funny enough to laugh at him, despite his rudeness. They couldn't be too offended. Terry quickly turned and glared at me. "I don't care who thought it was funny, Grant." I raised my hand to stop her, trying my best to keep a straight face without smirking. "Mr. Simmons for you." She took a deep breath, her nostrils flaring with barely concealed anger, and her face turning a fiery shade of pink. "Okay, Mr. Simmons," she said abruptly, spitting out my last name as if it were a curse word. "The problem is not whether some people find it funny or not. The problem is that many women I work with find it offensive and demeaning. After the incident, I personally spoke with every woman in my department, and they were almost unanimous in their disagreement." I sighed loudly. "Naturally, they are all afraid to contradict you, and therefore gave the answer that you wanted to hear. Let's face it, some of these women laughed at the joke and may have repeated it, but none of them can stand up to you, so now they claim it upset them." Terry was still shaking her head. "Your unwillingness to face the truth, Mr. Simmons, is troubling. The women in this company deserve..." "Women in this group," I interrupted firmly, "are just as likely to tell a bad joke or make a sexually charged remark about men as men are about women." Terry laughed mockingly. "Don't be funny. The problem here, as elsewhere with sexual harassment, is men. Women simply don't contribute to this problem here, or in any other workplace for that matter." I was completely stunned that she would make such a statement, and was momentarily speechless. "Are you saying that only men create such problems? That they are the only ones who violate corporate standards of conduct?" "The facts speak for themselves," she said grandly, making a gesture towards Gabriel, and then passing the gesture to all the other men sitting at the table, implying, at least to me, that she despises us all. That evening I returned home in a bad mood. Rosie, my wife, sensed this immediately and tried to smooth things over. We had a nice dinner, and she let me play with our two boys while she cleaned up. After they went to bed, we watched TV for a while until she snuggled up to me, licked my ear, and asked if I wanted to talk about what was bothering me. I denied that anything was wrong, but she laughed at my obvious evasiveness, and I ended up talking about the tension in the office and how Terry had turned a relatively harmless joke into a serious problem. She made me tell her this joke, and she moaned and laughed, and then shook her head. Well, that certainly leaves me with an visual image. I guess I can understand how someone who is a little conservative might find this quite offensive, but I felt a surge of disappointment and interrupted her irritably. Great. Now my wife signs a contract with my worst enemy. Rosie's face took on an expression of disappointed surprise. Come on, Grant. I took a deep breath and raised my hand to stop her. Sorry, this thing probably threw me off track. I did not want to. She tilted her head and examined me like a doctor wondering what might be troubling a patient. Why are you letting that obstinate bitch get to you? Do you really care? I know. I shouldn't care, and usually don't. But now her problems are starting to seriously undermine morale. Honestly, I think this could be a big problem for Gabe. Well, Gabe isn't here right now, so I can't help with that, but maybe I can do something for you. She bit her lip, raised her eyebrows defiantly, and then leaned down and kissed me, letting her hand slide down to my crotch. Just so you know, she whispered, breathing quickly, I'm glad you're half-ass. It can be socially awkward when you start bucking in public, but in the bedroom it makes things a lot more interesting. I laughed, and she smiled at me, unbuttoned my pants, and made me feel much better. At work, over the next few weeks, the battle between Terry and I continued, complete with snide smirks and snarky remarks, both sides quick to point out any slight lapse in standards, any behavior towards the opposite sex that might cross or even approach the line of good taste and appropriate behavior. Notes were sent, stories were told, and exaggerated. Everyone was on edge, and morale had reached a new low. The entire staff seemed to be walking on eggshells, and no one was happy. It's no surprise that our productivity has decreased and questions have arisen. I received several emails from Jim Gompers, the vice president in charge of our department, asking what was going on. I tried to downplay the interpersonal problems and predicted that the department would soon gain momentum again, but he wasn't convinced and ended up sending a couple of performance review guys and someone from HR to look into the situation. As might be expected, scrutiny from the big bosses did nothing to improve the atmosphere, and when questions were asked, employees did not exude a sense of teamwork. People started pointing fingers and criticizing each other, tensions grew, and by the end of the month, one fairly important employee had quit, and two others had hinted very strongly that they were looking for work elsewhere. After a fair amount of heartache, I accepted that I was part of the problem to some extent and arranged a couple of talks with Terry to try to broker a truce that would allow the office to function at a reasonable level. However, unexpectedly, it turned out that her understanding of what the problems were and what to do about them was radically different from mine. Her position was that there was a lack of discipline in the office and that we needed to get tough, maybe even fire some people, rather than try to make it a more relaxed place to work. I tried to understand her point of view, first politely and then with less diplomacy. We ended up arguing heatedly, and our positions hardened rather than softened. By our last meeting, she was insisting that we lay down the law to our colleagues and that we make the decision to fire rather than reprimand Gabe. I made it clear that I will not tolerate any purge and will block it by any means necessary. Shortly after our last conversation, Terry took the next shot at her "get tough" policy by sending out a general email detailing her intent to bring even the most minor violation of company rules to the attention of HR and to more thoroughly evaluate workplace performance by imposing disciplinary sanctions on those she perceived to be falling behind. She also sent emails to me and other managers confirming her intention to crack down on Gabe and several other employees who she felt were slacking. Productivity improved slightly, but the work environment continued to deteriorate, and another employee quit. The philosophical gap between Terry and I became insurmountable, and I became convinced that something had to be done. Around this time, some guys invited me to play pool one evening. I don't usually socialize too much, but given the circumstances at work, I was more than interested in any activity that might boost morale and decided I could use a little fun myself, so I called Rosie to make sure everything would be okay. It's okay if I come home late and let her know I'll have dinner. We went to a local place that had 3 tables and a pretty good bar and grill, so between games we sat around eating and drinking. I was having a good time chatting with the guys, discussing football, golf, and the stock market, when inevitably the conversation turned to women. The guys started talking about who they thought looked good, then moved on to who they'd like to sleep with, and then, quietly, almost in a whisper, they started mentioning who actually slept with whom. There was a young guy named Devin Tinian who worked in the shipping department and had a reputation for being very popular with the ladies. For a while, he listened to other stories, but then he began to brag himself. He talked about the women he had managed to get and how easy it was, and, encouraged by the nodding and smiling guys around him, he finally talked about how he was sure that if he had enough time, he could get in almost any bed. He wasn't shy or particularly reserved. He named places, times, methods, and names, and some of his speeches were difficult to believe. After some time, after listening to him, I mocked him a little, saying that he thought too much of himself. He huffed in annoyance and continued, glancing at me from time to see if I had heard his last statement. He seemed to want to make sure I knew about all his exploits. After a while, I didn't want to listen anymore, but I didn't want to ask him to stop, so I slipped away to a corner table, ordered fries, and started eating alone. The group began to disperse and play pool, and Devin, uninvited, plopped down in the seat next to me. "Hey, I thought you thought I was talking nonsense." I listened to him for a minute. "Seriously, boy, I'm sure you've had a lot of women, but I just don't buy the idea that you've never been too tired or that you can seduce any woman you want. This is pure nonsense, okay? So don't try to feed me such phrases. I just don't buy it. Look, boy, just because you can't imagine it doesn't mean I can't do it." His confidence and arrogance were annoying. I clasped my hands together and thought for a minute, looking at him doubtfully. "So you say, you can get any woman into bed? Any woman at all?" "Yes. So if I show you a woman, not some hag or granny, someone with whom you can go to bed without closing your eyes, are you absolutely sure that you can fuck her? Not to kiss or caress, but to really fuck her?" "Yes, if there is enough time." He looked thoughtful for a second. "And she must like guys." Crossing my arms, I continued to look at him skeptically, pursing my lips as I considered his words and the confidence with which he spoke them. I decided to challenge him. "Are you ready to bet on it?" "Money?" "Yes, exactly. Bet. We chose a girl. You'll win if you sleep with her. I win if you quit the game after a reasonable amount of time." "How much time?" "Let's say a month or so." "Will money suit you? I don't want to spend a lot of time and effort trying to get some girl into bed and then have you pretend it was some kind of joke or something." "Certainly. Ask about me if you want, but you have to provide some evidence. I should see a cell phone photo or something. I have to be sure it's not photoshopped, but I'll bet you 5 that you won't be able to present this within a month." He sat back and thought about the bet, and I studied him for a few more moments, trying to decide if he could pull it off. He seemed like the kind of guy that women would like. Tall, athletic, with the obligatory 3-day stubble. He had the kind of appearance that gets men roles in films and television. His good looks, combined with his obvious self-confidence and gift of gab, made it easy to believe that he was a successful Romeo. But I still doubted that he could get any woman, especially the one I had in mind. Perhaps he was thinking the same thing, because doubt appeared on his face, quickly dissolving into his overconfidence. "Okay, you're in. I agree. But who is this chick?" I leaned back and looked at the ceiling, pretending to think. After a couple of minutes, I leaned forward and looked at him with a smirk. "Do you know who Terry Lee is?" He furrowed his brow and shook his head slightly. "She works in accounting. Wavy brown hair, height about 68 meters. There are several freckles, kind of bitchy." An expression of recognition flashed across his face. "Like big breasts, nice butt, wears mostly trousers, kind of strict?" "Yes, more or less true." "Oh yeah, I know her. She looks very good. Isn't she the one that bugs everyone about sensitivity in the workplace and other bullshit?" "Yes. Is this a problem?" Well, that is, if you find it too harsh and you want to refuse. I raised my eyebrows, hinting for him to say no. No way, dude. No way. She's probably not at work, and cool girls are a lot more fun than sluts. I laughed at his arrogance. Then it's okay. In business? He gave me an unbearably confident grin, extended his hand, and we shook hands. In business, Terry Lee, you have a month. So here it is. A classic win-win situation for me. If he fails, he will have to admit his failure and pay me $500. If he succeeds, well, then I will have something to counter Terry's constant argument that all men are pigs and that any violation of rules in the workplace should be dealt with as strongly as possible. I will have something irrefutable and personal. That evening, I returned home in a very good mood and found that Rosie was even better. By any standard, Rosie is not a big girl. Her weight of 68 kilograms is twice that of mine, and she is a little over 1.5 meters tall. But she's a little unhappy with herself because of the slight flab that hasn't gone away since the birth of her second child 6 years ago. So when she found she couldn't fit into her old favorite jeans, she went on the weight loss warpath and worked hard to get back to in its original form.